It was the kind of night that made the prairie whisper. The wind was dry, sharp like broken glass, and the moon hung low, casting silver across the hills like a warning. Most ranchers would have barred their doors and loaded their rifles, especially with rumors of Apache scouts moving through the region. But not Thomas Grady. Out on his isolated stretch of land, miles from the nearest lawman, he found something lying in the dirt, something that should have made him turn away. A wounded Apache warrior, barely breathing, blood dark against his chest, eyes flickering between life and the long shadow beyond it. Thomas didn't hesitate, not out of bravery, but something deeper, older. Maybe it was the memory of war still etched in his bones, or the way the warrior's gaze held not fear, but fire. He dragged the man into his barn under cover of darkness, patched the wounds with trembling hands, and sat beside him through the coldest hours, a shotgun within reach but untouched. In those hours, no words passed between them. Just breath, just pain, just a fragile truce born not of peace, but of humanity. The next morning, Thomas buried the bloodied rags in silence and watched the man disappear into the horizon, never expecting to see him again. He didn't tell the townsfolk. He didn't write it in his ledger. He just carried the memory like a weight in his chest, unsure if he'd saved a man or invited vengeance into his home. Because in those days, kindness was often mistaken for weakness, and mercy could cost a man everything he owned, including his life. But days later, just as the sun broke across the hills and the cattle began to stir, Thomas stepped out onto his porch and froze. Standing along every edge of his fence, still, silent, and unmoving, were 400 Apache warriors. Not a word was spoken, not a weapon drawn, just their presence, surrounding him like the very land had risen to watch. The same man he had saved stood at the front, arms folded, eyes locked on his. And in that moment, Thomas realized this wasn't a warning. It was something far rarer in the Old West, a reckoning of respect. What happened next was never written in newspapers or passed around saloons. But if you stay with this story, if you let it unfold with every breath and heartbeat it deserves, you'll see how a single act of compassion in the dead of night echoed louder than 1,000 bullets, and carved a place for one man in the hearts of those he was taught to fear. Because sometimes, in a world full of division and dust, all it takes to change everything is the courage to see the enemy as human. Thomas Grady had never been known for his softness. A former cavalry scout turned rancher, he was a man molded by droughts, betrayals, and the loss of a brother during the Comanche raids. His land was dry, his speech drier, and the only thing he trusted was the sound of his boots in the dust. Yet that night, something in him cracked, not from weakness, but from memory. The Apache warrior he'd pulled from the edge of death reminded him of the men he'd once ridden beside during the war, men whose blood ran red like anyone else's when the bullet found bone. He cleaned the wound as best he could, working with trembling hands and an old canteen of whiskey. The warrior didn't flinch, didn't speak, just stared at Thomas with a mixture of defiance and exhaustion. No name was exchanged, no promise made, only a silent agreement. Survival came first, everything else could wait. Thomas laid him on a bed of straw, covered him with his own coat, and sat just beyond reach with a rifle across his lap. Not pointed, not cocked, just there. By morning, the man was gone. No footprints, no blood trail, just the faint scent of tobacco and the memory of eyes that seemed to carry centuries. Thomas didn't sleep much after that. He checked the fences 3 times a day, kept the horses saddled, and started carrying 2 revolvers instead of 1. Not out of regret, but because in the Old West, doing the right thing didn't mean you were safe. It just meant you were ready to pay the price for it. The townsfolk noticed his change in behavior. "You see something out there, Grady?" the sheriff asked one afternoon over coffee. Thomas just stared at the horizon. "Storm's coming," he said, though the sky was clear. The others laughed, called him paranoid, said maybe he was finally cracking under the weight of solitude. But Thomas wasn't afraid of war. He was afraid of what he might have started, of the line he might have crossed when he chose compassion over caution. It wasn't long after that when they came. 400 strong. No war paint, no shouting, just silence. Like ghosts made of bone and ash, they surrounded the ranch before dawn. Thomas stood on his porch barefoot, armed with nothing but a lantern and the breath caught in his throat. Then he saw him, the wounded warrior, now standing tall, eyes steady, wearing a necklace of feathers that swayed with the morning wind. And though no words were spoken, the meaning was unmistakable. We remember. For what felt like an eternity, no one moved. The wind curled through the dry grass. The horses in the stable shifted uneasily, and Thomas stood frozen, not from fear, but from awe. These weren't raiders. They weren't invaders. They were witnesses. 400 warriors who had crossed valleys, rivers, and prejudices to be here, not to punish, but to honor. Because out there, on land soaked in blood and suspicion, a man had chosen mercy, and that mattered more than anyone could imagine. The warrior he had saved stepped forward alone, every eye watching. His stride was slow, deliberate. When he reached the porch, he placed something at Thomas's feet, a blade, intricately carved with bone and stone, the kind passed from generation to generation. It wasn't a threat. It was a symbol, a token, a gift of protection, or perhaps of understanding. Thomas knelt slowly, picked it up, and nodded once, deep, without ego, just the kind of respect men of the earth give to those who've earned it. Then came the turn. One by one, the warriors shifted. They didn't speak, didn't gesture. They simply turned their backs to the ranch, as if to say, "You are watched, you are remembered, you are safe." And then they walked, not hurried, not chaotic, but like water returning to a riverbed. In less than 15 minutes, the plains were empty again, save for Thomas, the blade in his hand, and the echo of something ancient now etched into the soil around his home. The town never believed him. Not fully. A few ranch hands claimed they saw shadows that morning, but most chalked it up to a story grown tall from whiskey and loneliness. Thomas never argued. He just kept the blade on the mantle, where it gleamed in the firelight like a silent witness. And from that day forward, no one ever trespassed on his land. Not coyote, not man, not storm. As if the very earth around him had shifted in allegiance. But Thomas knew the truth. He knew that out there, past the ridges and the river, there were eyes that watched and remembered. And that one night, under cover of starlight, he had crossed a line most men were too proud, or too afraid, to step over. Not out of obligation, not out of strategy, but out of instinct. And for that, 400 warriors stood guard at his fence, not with violence, but with honor. And in the West, that was rarer than peace itself. Life on the ranch resumed, but something inside Thomas had shifted. He still fixed fences, broke wild horses, and hauled water like any other man, but his eyes no longer scanned the horizon with suspicion. They searched for meaning. Every creak in the trees, every gust of wind, now felt like a whisper from something older than memory. He had touched the edge of a world he'd been taught to fear and found not savagery, but a kind of sacred silence. And once a man knows that silence, the noise of the world never quite sounds the same again. He stopped carrying 2 revolvers. The second holster gathered dust by the door. Not out of naivety, but clarity. The land didn't need more bullets. It needed steadier hands and clearer eyes. That winter, when a band of settlers rode through and asked to rest on his land, Thomas welcomed them without hesitation. He watched their children run through the same fields where 400 warriors had once stood still, and something about the contrast struck him hard. Violence had passed through here and left behind peace. Months later, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. A young Apache boy, no more than 10 years old, rode up to the fence with a small bundle wrapped in leather. He said nothing, just handed it over and pointed to the hills before turning and disappearing into the dusk. Inside the bundle was a single eagle feather, perfectly white, and a scrap of tanned hide with a mark drawn in charcoal, 3 slashes crossing a circle. Thomas recognized it instantly. It was the mark of the man he'd saved. That night, as the fire crackled low and the stars blinked over the ridge, Thomas held the feather in his hands like a relic. He didn't know what it meant exactly. Perhaps protection, perhaps a bond renewed, but he understood the heart behind it. Some cultures use words, others use symbols, and some use silence, but they all tell stories. And this one was still being written, long after the riders had vanished into the grass. Not long after, a local merchant came by with news from the southern tribes. Whispers of peace talks, of warriors laying down arms, of a mysterious chief who spoke of honoring allies on land far to the north. Thomas said nothing, but a rare smile tugged at the edge of his mouth. He didn't claim credit. He didn't need to. He had already seen the ripple, and he knew that while history is often written in ink, the truth of it is usually carved in moments no one else sees. As the years unfolded, Thomas became something of a mystery to the town. They still saw him in the market, still nodded to him on Sundays, but there was a distance to him now, a reverence, almost. Children whispered stories about the ghost riders on his land. Old men spoke in hushed tones about the blade above his mantle. And while most dismissed it as legend, no one dared cross his fence without invitation. There were no signs, no warnings, just the unspoken understanding that this land was guarded by more than barbed wire. One spring, a drought swept through the region. Wells dried up, cattle dropped, and tempers flared. Neighboring ranchers grew desperate, turning on one another in quiet acts of theft and sabotage. But not a single hand was raised against Thomas's land. His fields remained untouched. His water, though scarce, was never stolen. Some said it was luck. Others said it was superstition. But Thomas knew better. Respect, real respect, was more powerful than any sheriff's badge or federal decree. He shared what little he had, quietly. An extra pail of water left by a fence post. A sack of flour dropped at a widow's door. No one saw him do it, but they knew it was him. He didn't seek recognition. He only remembered the night he was surrounded not by enemies, but by men whose silence meant trust. And in living by that trust, Thomas found something rare. Peace with himself, and a sense of belonging that no bloodline or title had ever given him. One day, as he walked the ridge at dusk, he found a line of small rocks stacked in perfect balance, 12 of them, spaced evenly, pointing west. It wasn't random. It was a sign, a mark left by someone who had passed through, someone who remembered. He stood there for a long time, hat in hand, the wind tugging at his coat, and whispered something into the emptiness, still here. Because he was. Still guarding. Still giving. Still honoring the moment when he chose to heal instead of harm. And that's what the land became. A place of quiet redemption. Where mercy once planted its seed in the middle of the night, and 400 silent men had stood to bear witness. Not because they were asked. Not because they were owed. But because even in a world of broken treaties and bitter soil, a single act of decency still had the power to echo farther than anyone could ever ride. The seasons changed like the turning of a slow, steady wheel, and with each passing year, Thomas Grady grew more a part of the land he'd vowed to protect. The fence lines he once repaired with rough hands now seemed to glow under the weight of memories. Every nail hammered was a reminder of the night when mercy had rewritten history. The land held stories, whispered on the wind, rustling through the grass, carried by the distant call of coyotes under a starry sky. One afternoon, a group of native children came riding towards the ranch on ponies, their faces curious but cautious. They had heard tales of the man who had saved an Apache warrior and earned the respect of 400 silent guardians. Thomas welcomed them without hesitation, teaching them how to tend horses and plant seeds, sharing the wisdom of the land without words, but with kindness. He understood that true respect crossed all boundaries, and that healing was a journey shared by many. As twilight fell, one of the boys asked Thomas why the warriors never came back. Thomas looked to the horizon, eyes heavy with decades of remembrance. Because their word was given, and a man's word out here is as strong as steel, he said. When you honor someone, it lasts longer than any war. The children listened, wide-eyed, learning that courage isn't only found in battle, but also in acts of compassion and trust. But the past never stays buried. One winter, news arrived of rising tensions in nearby territories, whispers of renewed conflicts and broken promises. Thomas knew the fragile peace could shatter like thin ice. He wrote a letter, sending it through trusted hands to the chiefs he had once honored. It was a plea for peace, a reminder that even in a world torn by pain, bridges could be built on the foundation of respect and mercy. Back on the ranch, the fire burned low as Thomas sat alone on the porch. His thoughts were heavy, but his heart held a quiet hope. The hope that one day, the silent warrior's watch would mean more than a memory, that their presence would inspire generations to come. And in the stillness of the night, as the wind swept across the plains, Thomas whispered a prayer, knowing that sometimes the smallest acts could change the course of history forever. Spring breathed new life into the prairie, and with it came unexpected visitors, a delegation of tribal elders, accompanied by warriors who carried the same solemn silence Thomas had once witnessed. They came not as invaders, but as emissaries of peace, bearing gifts woven from leather and feathers, symbols of alliance and gratitude. Their arrival stirred the town, awakening old fears, but also a cautious hope that the past might finally heal. Thomas met the delegation at the edge of his land, hands steady despite the years. The leader, an elder with eyes sharp as eagle talons, stepped forward and handed Thomas a carved wooden bowl, etched with the story of a warrior saved by kindness. "You honored us when many would have chosen war," the elder said softly. "And for that, our people stand with you." In that moment, the fence around Thomas's ranch was more than wood and wire. It was a testament to trust earned through courage and grace. News of the peace agreement spread slowly, reaching neighboring towns and settlements, inspiring talks of treaties and shared futures. Thomas found himself at the heart of a changing West, a place where enemies could become allies, where silence could speak volumes, and where a single act of mercy had sown seeds that blossomed beyond his wildest dreams. Years later, as Thomas grew old and the weight of his memories settled like dust on his shoulders, he knew his legacy would not be found in wealth or land, but in the hearts of those who chose understanding over hatred. The warriors who once surrounded his fence remained a silent guardian, not just of his home, but of the hope that kindness could endure in a world scarred by conflict. On the final evening of his life, Thomas sat beneath the stars, the ancient blade resting by his side. He whispered a thanks to the wind, for the rain that had brought him a wounded stranger, for the silent warriors who honored his choice, and for the chance to show that even in the darkest of nights, the light of compassion could never be extinguished. The passing years softened the rugged edges of the land and its keeper alike. Thomas found solace in the rhythm of seasons, each sunrise a quiet promise that the past, with all its scars, was becoming part of a larger story, one of healing and unlikely friendships. The old blade remained displayed above the hearth, a reminder that courage can be as silent as a whispered wind, yet as sharp as the edge it carries. Visitors came rarely, but when they did, they spoke in hushed tones about the ranch surrounded by silence and respect. Elders from distant tribes and townspeople alike shared tales of the night when warriors stood guard, not to threaten, but to protect. Children listened wide-eyed as these stories were passed down, learning that honor transcended blood and language, that sometimes peace was forged in the act of seeing the humanity in the other. Thomas continued to teach what he knew, not with words, but through example. He showed patience in tending to wounded animals, kindness in sharing scarce water, and strength in standing firm against fear and hatred. His life became a living testament that the Wild West wasn't just a place of guns and grudges, but a land where even the most hardened hearts could find redemption. One crisp autumn evening, a young man arrived at the ranch, the son of one of the elders who had once stood in silent vigil. He carried with him a bundle of feathers and a letter of gratitude, acknowledging Thomas's role in a peace that had since spread across the region. The exchange was brief, but in their shared gaze, there was a mutual understanding. Bridges built in silence often endure longer than walls built with words. As the fire flickered low and the stars blanketed the sky, Thomas felt the weight of his journey settle into a quiet peace. He had lived a life many would have deemed unlikely, one where a single act of compassion had summoned a legion of silent guardians and transformed enemies into allies. In the stillness, he whispered a final prayer, knowing that the legacy of mercy would outlast even the fiercest storms. With age, Thomas's steps slowed, but his spirit remained unyielding. The ranch, once isolated and vulnerable, had become a beacon of hope and reconciliation. The fence that had once been merely a boundary now symbolized a line of trust between cultures, between men, between histories long marked by conflict. Travelers who passed by often paused, sensing the invisible presence of those 400 silent warriors watching over the land. In the community, Thomas was no longer seen as just a rugged loner, but as a bridge, a living example that courage is not only found in battle, but in the choice to heal. Young men and women sought him out to hear his stories, to learn how to stand firm when the world demanded division. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried the weight of a man who had stared into darkness and chosen the light. The land responded in kind. Crops grew stronger, the soil richer, and the rivers fuller. The harmony that had blossomed from that fateful night under the stars extended beyond the boundaries of the ranch, touching towns and tribes alike. It was a reminder that peace, like the prairie wind, cannot be seen but is deeply felt. One winter, as snow blanketed the hills, Thomas gathered his closest friends, both settlers and tribal members, for a quiet feast. Around the fire, stories flowed, laughter echoed, and for the first time in many years, the wounds of the past seemed distant. The blade, once a symbol of survival, now lay resting on the table, a shared heirloom of a journey from conflict to kinship. As Thomas looked around at the faces illuminated by firelight, he knew his story was more than his own. It was the story of a land healed by kindness, a people united by respect, and a legacy born not from violence, but from the courage to see beyond fear. And in that moment, beneath a sky full of stars, he understood that true strength had always been silent, steadfast, and fiercely compassionate. The years rolled on, and with them came new challenges. The West was changing fast, railroads cutting through sacred grounds, settlers pushing further, and old grudges resurfacing like restless ghosts. But the peace Thomas had helped nurture held strong, rooted deep in the respect forged that night when 400 silent warriors stood guard. It was a fragile peace, yes, but stronger than any treaty scrawled on paper or promise whispered in haste. Thomas found himself called upon more often, by both settlers and tribal leaders, as a mediator, a man who had lived through war but chose mercy, a rare voice bridging worlds. His counsel wasn't loud or forceful, but it carried weight, because it came from a man who had faced the storm and stood with open hands. People listened, not because they had to, but because they trusted that his way was the only way that could hold the West together. One afternoon, a young scout arrived, breathless from a long ride, bringing news of skirmishes brewing beyond the distant hills. Thomas didn't raise a rifle. Instead, he gathered leaders from both sides under the old oak, the same tree that had witnessed decades of quiet strength, and spoke of a night when warriors chose honor over hate. His words wove a story of mercy, trust, and the power of seeing the other as human. It was not an easy peace to broker, but it was one that held. As dusk settled, Thomas stood alone by the fence, the cold biting at his bones, but his heart warm with purpose. The land stretched out before him, a tapestry of past battles and future hopes. Somewhere beyond the hills, he imagined the silent warriors watching still, guardians of a promise that had outlasted guns and greed. In the fading light, Thomas whispered a vow to keep that promise alive, as long as breath remained in his body. That night, the wind carried his words across the plains. Peace is fragile, but possible. Respect is earned, not given. And sometimes, the greatest battles are won not with blood, but with compassion. These truths were the legacy of a man who had dared to save a stranger and, in doing so, had changed the course of history forever. In his final days, Thomas was surrounded not just by friends, but by a community united through years of healing. Settlers and Native Americans gathered, sharing stories, laughter, and tears, a testament to the bond forged by a single act of kindness. The ranch had become a sanctuary, a place where old wounds were tended with patience and respect, where the past was honored but not allowed to define the future. As he lay beneath the vast sky one evening, Thomas felt the weight of his journey lift, replaced by a profound peace. He thought of the wounded warrior who had walked into his life like a storm and the 400 silent guardians who had turned the tide of fear into one of honor. His heart swelled with gratitude for the chance to show that even in a world marked by division, a single act of mercy could echo through generations. The community gathered for a final farewell beneath the ancient oak, the blade resting beside Thomas's hand. No grand eulogies were spoken. Instead, a quiet reverence filled the air, a shared understanding that the story was far from over. It was a beginning, a call to remember that courage is found in compassion, and that peace is built on the foundations of respect. As the stars emerged, casting their gentle light across the land, a soft wind carried the promise that Thomas's legacy would live on, not in monuments or tales of glory, but in every quiet act of kindness that dared to challenge the darkness. For in the wild, unforgiving West, it was those moments of mercy that shone the brightest and lasted the longest. And so, beneath that endless sky, the story of a man who saved a wounded Apache and earned the watchful guard of 400 silent warriors became more than legend. It became a timeless lesson in the power of seeing beyond fear, the strength in mercy, and the unbreakable bond forged by humanity itself. In a world often defined by conflict and division, the story of Thomas Grady reminds us that true strength lies not in the weapons we wield, but in the compassion we choose to show. One man's decision to save a wounded stranger, at great personal risk, set into motion a ripple of honor and respect that no force could contain. It is a powerful reminder that courage often wears the quietest face, and that mercy can transform even the harshest land into a place of peace. The 400 silent warriors who surrounded Thomas's fence were not there to punish or threaten. They stood as guardians of a bond forged in understanding. Their presence teaches us that respect transcends boundaries, cultures, and histories. It challenges us to reconsider the lines we draw and the enemies we create when perhaps all we need is to see each other as human beings deserving of dignity and grace. This story leaves us with a profound truth. One act of kindness, no matter how small or risky, has the power to change the course of many lives. It calls on each of us to find the courage to reach beyond fear and prejudice, to stand for what is right even when it comes at a personal cost. Because sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with guns, but with hearts willing to heal. If this story moved you, if it awakened something deep within you, don't let that feeling fade. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know what this story meant to you. Like the video to help it reach those who might need this message. And subscribe to our channel for more stories that honor the quiet, powerful acts that shape our world. Your engagement helps keep these lessons alive, weaving connection and hope in a world that desperately needs both. Remember, true courage is not just in grand gestures, but in the simple, steadfast choice to see beyond ourselves. In the echoes of Thomas's story, may you find inspiration to stand with kindness, to act with honor, and to believe that even in the darkest nights, compassion can light the way forward.